In the autumn of 1921, a young man carried a black leather satchel into an office at the Department of the Interior and set it on the secretary's desk. What it held was payment for oil the United States Navy had sealed away for its own emergency fleet, in the exchange history would come to call Teapot Dome. The satchel held $100,000, counted out in 5 stacks of $20,000 each, and it bought a lease to reserves that 2 of the richest oilmen America had ever produced had spent years trying to reach. But the story of that satchel is also the story of oil fields the Navy sealed away and signed off in secret, of $100,000 carried by the oilman's own son, of a man who went to prison for taking that money while the men who paid it walked free, and of 2 of the couriers who carried the bag, found dead together years later in the mansion the oil fortune built. Chapter 1. The Oil the Navy Buried. Before that satchel changed hands, the ground itself had already been marked off from every other acre of federal territory in the country, set aside for a single purpose and locked against every ordinary use. The story begins not with a bribe, but with a warship's fuel tank. Beginning around 1909, the United States Navy made the decision to convert its battle fleet from coal to oil, trading the black smoke and slow bunkering of the coal-fired era for the speed and range that petroleum gave a modern battleship. A fleet that ran on oil could refuel at sea, outrun a coal-burning rival, and cross an ocean without stopping at a coaling station an enemy might control. But an oil-burning Navy needed oil it could reach without asking a private company for it, and Congress agreed. Rather than leave the nation's future fuel supply to the open market, lawmakers set aside oil-bearing federal land as emergency naval reserves, sealed against private drilling and held in trust for the fleet alone. 3 parcels carried that trust. In California, the government drew the boundaries around Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills, 2 stretches of oil-rich desert in Kern County already ringed by private derricks working the same underground pool. In Wyoming, north of the young cattle town of Casper, surveyors marked off a dome of rock the local ranch hands had nicknamed for its shape, a low sandstone rise said to resemble the spout and lid of a kettle on a stove. The government made it official in 1915, adding Teapot Dome to the Naval Reserve System under that same folk name, so that a formation named by cowboys for its silhouette against the prairie sky became, on a federal map, sealed United States property. Sealed meant sealed. The oil under all 3 reserves was not to be pumped, sold, or leased in ordinary times. It was to stay in the ground, untouched, until the day the fleet actually needed it, a strategic account withdrawn only in an emergency Congress had not yet named. For over a decade, that is exactly what it did. Private companies working the fields next door watched their own straws draw down the same shared pool of oil that lay under both properties, while the reserve itself sat capped and idle, worth more to the nation asleep than any well then pumping. Some of those private wells stood close enough to the boundary line to reach under it. Oil does not respect a surveyor's stake, and a well drilled on private land beside Elk Hills or Teapot Dome could draw down crude that had originated on the government side of that line without ever crossing it on paper. The Navy's own engineers knew it. It was a slow leak in an otherwise sealed vault, and it would soon become the very argument used to justify opening the vault at all. Whether that sealing off was ever anything more than prudent wartime foresight, or was always a land grab waiting for the right men to unlock it, is a question the record leaves open, and a fair one to argue in the comments below. Was Washington protecting the fleet, or simply guarding treasure until someone arrived with the connections to collect it? But sealed did not mean forgotten. Oilmen who had spent their careers finding what other prospectors' surveys missed had watched Elk Hills and Teapot Dome sit locked for years. Private derricks, only a property line away from federal oil they were forbidden to touch. By the time the reserve had sat closed for the better part of a decade, at least two of the richest men in American oil had already decided that sealed land was not the same as land that could never be reached. Chapter 2. The Hand That Struck Oil. One of those two men had already spent half a lifetime searching the ground for something else before he ever found oil. Edward Doheny was, before anything, a prospector, one of the restless men who moved through the mining camps of the American West, chasing a strike and rarely finding one. He came to Los Angeles broke, and when he finally found what would make him one of the richest men in the country, he found it not with a drilling crew and a rig, but with his own hands, sinking a shaft into the ground the way a man digs who cannot afford to hire anyone else to do it. In 1892, that hand-dug well struck oil, and the discovery opened the Los Angeles oil field, a strike that turned a quiet basin of vineyards and bean fields into one of the most productive petroleum districts in the country within a few short years. A man who finds a fortune by hand does not easily forget the lesson of it. Doheny had learned at the bottom of a shaft he dug himself because he could afford no one to dig it for him, that the ground under a place everyone else had overlooked could still be made to pay if a man was willing to look where the rest of the field had already stopped looking. That single lesson, more than any one strike, was what carried him from a broke prospector standing over a hole in a Los Angeles lot to a man other oilmen watched and measured themselves against. From that single well, Doheny built an empire. He pushed south along the coast and out across the basin, and the company that carried his money and his name, Pan American Petroleum, grew into one of the largest independent oil concerns in the country, with tankers, refineries, and oil fields that answered to no government and no partner but him. In the years since digging that first well by hand, Doheny had risen to sit among the 2 or 3 richest oilmen America had ever produced, a fortune built on land he had found and land he had bought, none of it taken from anyone by anything but skill and nerve. He was, by every account of the men who did business with him, patient, exacting, and used to getting what he wanted. Those were the qualities that had built Pan American Petroleum, and they would, before this story ends, spend just as freely elsewhere. He also became, without ever asking for the role, a character in someone else's fiction. In 1927, the novelist Upton Sinclair published a novel called Oil, built around a driller who rises from nothing to command an oil empire and then buys the politicians he needs to protect it. Sinclair drew the shape of that rise from Doheny's own, and from the scandal already gathering around him at the time he wrote it, though he gave his driller a different name and sent him down a different road on the page. Decades later, that novel became the basis for a film called There Will Be Blood, and the oilman on the screen, self-made, ruthless, and finally undone by what his own hands had built, owes more to Edward Doheny than most of the people who have watched it ever learned. Sinclair did not have to invent the ambition or the appetite. He only had to watch where they were already leading. None of it, the well, the tankers, the fortune, required a single acre of the Navy's sealed reserves. Doheny had already proven he could find oil where no one else thought to look, on land he owned outright, by his own hand. But a man who has spent his life reading the ground for what other people missed does not stop reading it once he is rich, and by the time Washington began quietly reconsidering who should hold the nation's locked petroleum, sealed federal land had already caught the eye of exactly the kind of man who had always been good at finding what was supposed to stay buried. He was not yet the only one looking. Chapter 3. The Druggist Who Drilled an Empire. Doheny had at least started with oil under his own hands. The second man the reserves would eventually need had started further from it than that, behind a druggist's counter in a small Kansas town, weighing out powders and tinctures for other men's prescriptions and other men's ailments. Harry Sinclair was that druggist, and the counter taught him nothing about petroleum except how to measure precisely and how to keep an honest ledger, habits that would outlast the pharmacy by decades. When the oil fields of the American Midwest began pulling men out of steadier trades and into leases and drilling crews, Sinclair went with them, and he did not go slowly. Doheny had built his fortune well by well, sinking the first shaft himself before he ever owned a company to sink any more. Sinclair built his differently, buying, leasing, and combining, gathering smaller operators and smaller fields under a single name until the name itself, Sinclair Oil, stood among the largest petroleum concerns the country had produced. Where a driller answers to the ground itself, patient with it, a buyer answers to nothing but the next asking price, and Sinclair had shown from the start that he understood which of those two disciplines moved faster. The druggist, who had once measured doses by the grain, now measured his holdings by the oil field, and he had not touched a drilling rig himself in years. He no longer needed to. There had been once an ordinary world underneath that rise, drugstore towns and rented rooms and men who went west chasing a wage rather than a fortune, riding the same boom Sinclair rode, and most of them stayed exactly that poor for all of it. Sinclair was the rare one the boom actually paid in full, and the difference between him and the men he had once counted pills beside on a Kansas counter was not talent so much as timing and appetite, which is a harder thing for a small town to forgive, or to take much credit for once the money is that large. By the time the government's sealed reserves came within reach of men who knew how to reach for them, Sinclair Oil already answered to no bank and no partner but Harry Sinclair, and the appetite that had carried a druggist out of a Kansas storefront had only sharpened with the money behind it. For the reserve at Teapot Dome specifically, he chose not to use his own company's name at all. A second one stood ready to hold exactly this kind of land, built for the purpose and answerable to no shareholder who might ask where the land had come from. Mammoth Oil Company. Set beside Doheny, the two men made an unlikely pair to imagine wanting the same ground. Doheny was the older man, patient and exacting, a driller who had earned his acres by finding what other men had missed. Sinclair was faster and hungrier, a trader more than a driller, a man who had learned early that the shortest route to an oil field was rarely to dig one. But a shared purpose does not require two men to resemble each other, and by the early 1920s both wanted the same thing: petroleum the Navy had sealed away, untouched, under land that was not for sale. Between them and that land stood one office and one man in it. Neither of them yet knew his name. Chapter 4. The Poorest Man in the Cabinet. Neither oilman needed to learn the name of the office. They needed to learn the name of the man who held it, and in the spring of 1921, when the new administration in Washington filled its cabinet table, that name turned out to belong to nobody either of them would have picked for the part. Albert Fall was a senator from New Mexico, and before that a rancher and a lawyer and a prospector himself in a smaller and rougher way, none of it ever quite settling into wealth. His ranch stood at 3 rivers, on a stretch of dry basin land where the Sacramento Mountains threw their shadow over cracked earth, and a house built more for endurance than comfort. He had carried a mortgage on that ranch for years, the kind of debt a man in the arid West wore, the way another man wore a suit, visible to anyone who looked at the unmended fences and the herd thinning in a bad season. Of all the men who would sit at Warren Harding's cabinet table, The ones who later wrote the history agreed on one plain fact. Fall was the poorest. That poverty was not incidental to what he believed. Fall had spent a public career arguing that the government's grip on the West's land and timber and oil was a kind of theft in reverse. Federal acreage locked away from the men who lived beside it and knew how to use it. He had fought the conservation policies that fenced off resources for some future need instead of the present one, and he carried that argument with him into the Interior Department the way another man might carry a grudge. A sealed reserve, oil kept in the ground for a war that had not come and might never come again, was to him the purest example of the waste he had spent his career condemning. He believed the ground should work. He had simply never owned enough ground that worked well enough to pay off what he owed on it. Harding gave him the post anyway, and on the day Fall was sworn in as Secretary of the Interior, he sat down at a cabinet table across from men worth many times what his mortgaged ranch would fetch on its best day, men who had made and remade fortunes in coal and steel and, in Doheny's case, oil itself. Fall signed his name to the oath in the same hand that had signed promissory notes against his own ranch debts, and the difference between the men in that room was not a subtle one. It sat in the room with them, unremarked and unmissed. What the office gave him was not money. It gave him authority, jurisdiction over the nation's public domain, the forests and the grazing land, and, on paper, whatever oil-bearing acreage the federal government held anywhere within its borders. To a man who had spent a lifetime believing that land should be worked and not sealed, that authority must have felt less like a burden of trust than like a key finally placed in his own hand. But a key opens only what it is cut for, and the reserves Doheny and Sinclair wanted were not yet his to turn. Teapot Dome and the California fields at Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills had been set aside for the United States Navy, sealed by an earlier president's order and answerable, on paper, to the Navy's own officers, not to the Interior Department, and not to the mortgaged rancher from Three Rivers who now sat in the cabinet imagining what a working oil field could do for a man who had never once, in his whole life, gotten ahead of what he owed. The oil belonged to the fleet. Albert Fall had a desk and an oath, and a debt that did not care which office he held. What he did not yet have was the ground itself. Chapter 5. The land changed hands in the dark. The ground itself changed hands before either oilman drilled a single well upon it, and it changed hands in the plainest possible way, a signature on an order that most of Washington never read, and fewer still understood. On the 31st of May, 1921, President Harding signed an executive order that moved custody of the naval petroleum reserves, Teapot Dome in Wyoming, and Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills in California, out of the Navy Department's hands and into the Interior Department's. The order carried the consent of Edwin Denby, the Secretary of the Navy, who put his name beneath a sentence that surrendered his department's own oil. The reserves had been the Navy's to begin with for a reason. A decade earlier, as the fleet converted from coal to petroleum, Congress had set the ground aside specifically so that no cabinet department with a civilian budget to balance and a private industry to answer, however politely, could ever be tempted to touch it. The oil was meant to sit in the earth, untouched, until a war made it necessary. The whole design of the reserve system assumed that the service most likely to need the fuel would be the service holding the key to the ground it came from. The order of the 31st of May quietly broke that design. The reasoning offered at the time was administrative, almost bureaucratic in its dullness. Interior already managed the nation's public lands, its mines, its grazing acreage. So consolidating the reserves under one roof read, to the men who approved it, as tidiness rather than a transfer of power. No congressman rose to object on the floor of the House or the Senate. No newspaper ran the order above the fold. It moved through Washington the way paperwork moves. Unread by the men, it would eventually ruin, filed and forgotten in the space of an afternoon. But paperwork is never only paperwork. What Denby had signed away was not a filing cabinet's worth of forms. It was the Navy's own claim to defend the reserves as its own, the independent eye that had kept Teapot Dome and Elk Hills sealed against exactly the kind of arrangement Albert Fall had spent his career arguing for. The order did not create a bribe. It created a doorway, and it handed the only key to the one man in Washington already convinced the ground behind that door was being wasted. He did not waste the doorway once it opened. Fall had entered the cabinet with jurisdiction over the nation's public domain, and no jurisdiction at all over reserved naval oil. After the 31st of May, the second half of that sentence no longer applied. Teapot Dome and Elk Hills now sat inside the same file drawer as every other acre interior administered, land, like any other land, subject to leasing at the discretion of the one man in the cabinet who had spent 20 years arguing that sealed land was land wasted. 2 oilmen were already positioned to want it, though neither had yet been offered anything. Edward Doheny's Pan American Petroleum already ran wells within reach of the California Reserve, close enough that his interest in Elk Hills would need no invention. Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil had the capital and the operating scale for a lease the size of Teapot Dome, and Wyoming sat closer to his existing business than California sat to most men working in oil at all. Neither man had spoken to Fall about a lease. Neither yet needed to, because the order that mattered had already been signed, quietly, in a room where the loudest objection on record came from no one at all. What had belonged to the fleet now belonged, in practice, to the discretion of a single interior secretary with a mortgaged ranch and 20 years of grievance against the very idea of a reserve. The Navy still carried the reserves on its books as an emergency fuel supply, oil sealed for a fleet that might one day need every barrel of it. Interior now carried the pen. Between those two facts sat the entire scheme still to come, and neither the Navy nor the public knew, in the spring of 1921, that the two facts had ever been allowed to sit in the same room together. Nothing had been sold yet. Nothing had been signed to any oilman's name. The transaction still to come would need a lease, a lawyer, and in time a black satchel of cash. But the transaction that made all of it possible had already happened. On the 31st of May, in the quiet stroke of a pen no one outside the cabinet room thought worth watching. The leasing had not yet begun. The door had. Chapter 6. The Bag in the Night. The door had opened in the spring. By autumn, someone finally walked through it, and he did not come empty-handed. Doheny wanted Elk Hills, the California Reserve his own Pan American Petroleum wells already bordered, close enough that his interest needed no invention and no introduction. What he needed was a lease, and a lease needed a signature from the one man in Washington who now held the pen. A lease of that size, argued in the open, would have drawn lawyers, competing bidders, and newspapermen asking why federal oil sealed for the fleet was being handed to a single company without a bid ever taken. That argument was never made in the open. Instead, in the autumn of 1921, Doheny sent his son east, carrying with him the one thing a signature like that was worth. Edward Lawrence Doheny, Jr., known to everyone who loved him as Ned, was not a courier by trade. He was a young man with his father's name and none of his father's hunger, sent on an errand his father judged too delicate to trust to a clerk or a lawyer, the kind of errand a family keeps inside the family. He did not travel alone. Hugh Plunkett, his friend since boyhood and now his father's secretary, went with him, the two of them carrying between them a black leather satchel that neither would let out of his sight for the length of the journey east. Inside the satchel sat $100,000 in cash, counted into 5 stacks of $20,000 each, bound and stacked the way a bank counts money it never expects to see itemized in a courtroom. It had been drawn, quietly, from Doheny's own funds, carried across the country by 2 young men who understood only that the money was for Secretary Fall and that the matter was not to be discussed. Neither of them was told in so many words what the money was buying. Neither of them needed to be. They delivered it to Fall's private rooms in Washington after dark, the satchel changing hands the way such things always change hands, quickly, quietly, between men who had rehearsed exactly how little would be said. There was no ceremony to it. No lawyer stood in the room to witness the transfer of $100,000, no bank officer to record it, no clerk to file it, only 2 young men who had crossed a continent to hand over a bag and a cabinet secretary who took it without asking either of them a single question about where it had come from. Fall took the bag. In its place he offered a note, unsecured, without interest, without a fixed date for repayment, the kind of paper a bank would never accept, and a friend supposedly would. He called it a loan. Nothing about the arrangement resembled one. The note itself was torn. Fall tore it across its face before either young man left the room, one jagged half staying with Doheny's people, the other kept in Fall's own hand, so that the 2 pieces could someday be laid edge to edge and proven to belong to each other. A signature split in half between 2 men who trusted each other only exactly as far as that. It was a small thing, a scrap of paper folded into a coat pocket, meaningless to anyone who saw it without already knowing what it was. Years later, a Senate committee would know exactly what it was and go looking for both halves. Ned and Plunkett went home believing the matter closed. Their fathers, in the case of one of them, and their employer, in the case of both, had asked them to carry a bag from one coast to the other, and they had carried it, and the bag was gone, and that was the whole of what either young man understood the errand to be. They had grown up together, worked together, and now they had carried a cabinet officer's bribe together, and neither thought of it as anything more than a favor done for the elder Doheny, the kind of errand a loyal son and a loyal friend simply performed without asking why. Neither could have known, delivering a satchel into a dark room in the Capitol, that they had just carried the first piece of evidence in a case that would not close for the rest of their lives, nor how short the rest of their lives would turn out to be. The lease itself followed the money rather than preceding it, the paperwork arriving in its own time once the private matter was settled, formalizing what the satchel had already decided. Roughly 32,000 acres of the Navy's own sealed reserve at Elk Hills passed to Pan American Petroleum, signed by the one man in the cabinet who had the authority to sign it and, as of that autumn night, every reason not to refuse. Oil that had been set aside for the fleet, oil no private company had been permitted to touch since before the war, now belonged on paper to Doheny, and the paper that made it so had been bought with cash that fit inside a bag 2 young men could carry between them. But Doheny's satchel was not the only payment moving toward Fall's rented rooms that year, and it was not the larger one. A second oilman, further along in his own courtship of the reserves, was preparing to pay for Teapot Dome in a currency that would not fit in any bag, bonds, cash, and cattle enough to fill out the herd on a ranch that had, until recently, been too poor to feed one. Chapter 7. The Bonds and the Cattle. Sinclair did not send a son across the country with a satchel. He did not need to. What Fall wanted from him could travel by wire and by mail, wrapped in the ordinary machinery of finance, and by the spring of 1922 it had already begun arriving in New Mexico. The lease for Teapot Dome, the Wyoming reserve named for the spout of rock jutting from the plain north of Casper, was signed on the 7th of April, 1922, handing Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company the drilling rights the Navy had sealed away more than a decade earlier. Where Doheny had paid in cash counted by hand into a black bag, Sinclair paid in paper that carried his name nowhere at all. Government and Liberty bonds, the same certificates ordinary Americans had bought to finance the war Fall had cheered from the Senate floor, moved out of Sinclair's accounts and into Fall's, better than $200,000 of them, and cash, besides that, carried the whole arrangement past $250,000, well beyond what Doheny had carried in his son's satchel. $198,000 of it traveled by way of Marlon Everhart, Fall's own son-in-law, who accepted delivery of the Liberty bonds and passed them along inside the family rather than across a stranger's desk. A bond, unlike a satchel of cash, could be traced to the hand that bought it and the hand that redeemed it. Sinclair and Fall both seemed content to trust that no one would ever look. Something else followed the bonds to the Three Rivers Ranch that spring, something no wire transfer or bond certificate could account for. Cattle arrived on land that had carried too thin a herd for years, filling out pastures a debt-ridden rancher could never have restocked on a senator's salary. A cabinet secretary's ranch was not supposed to grow richer the same season he signed away the Navy's oil. On the Three Rivers Range in 1922, it did exactly that, and no one delivering the herd troubled to explain why to the neighbors who watched it happen. Add the two payments together, and the shape of the year became difficult to mistake for coincidence. $100,000 in cash from Doheny, counted into 5 stacks of $20,000 and carried by hand. More than $250,000 in bonds and cash from Sinclair, nearly $200,000 of it routed through a son-in-law rather than handed over directly. A herd of cattle grazing on a ranch that had been too poor the year before to feed one. 2 of the richest oilmen in the country had paid a single cabinet secretary approaching $400,000 between them, against 2 leases that together had cost neither man a single day of open competition or a single rival bid. None of it was declared. None of it was taxed, recorded, or explained to the department Fall nominally served. It sat instead in New Mexico, converted into bonds, redeemed at leisure, and livestock standing in plain sight of any neighbor who cared to count them, the evidence not locked in a vault, but grazing beside a county road. Fall had spent a career practicing the discretion of men who move money quietly through Washington rooms after dark. He had never had occasion to practice hiding a herd in daylight. The ranch he had mortgaged twice over, the ranch every neighbor for 20 miles had watched him fail to save, was about to stop looking like a poor man's ranch. And the moment it did, the discretion that had carried 2 oilmen and a cabinet secretary through 2 secret leases would run out, not in a courtroom, not in a Senate hearing room, but on a stretch of New Mexico rangeland where a debt long overdue was suddenly, inexplicably, paid in full. Chapter 8. The Ranch That Gave Him Away. A ranch does not lie easily. A man can carry a secret through every hallway in Washington and still leave it standing in a fence line for any neighbor with eyes to read. By the autumn of 1922, the Three Rivers Ranch in New Mexico had stopped looking like the ranch its neighbors had watched fail for a decade. The back taxes that had gone unpaid year after year were suddenly settled in full with no explanation offered to the county clerk who recorded the payment. Land bordering the property, land Fall had spent years unable to hold on to, began passing into his name again, parcel by parcel. New fencing went up where the old wire had rusted through. Water that had never reached the far pastures started reaching them. None of it was hidden. All of it sat in plain view beside a public road, where a poor man's ranch had, in the space of a single season, stopped behaving like one. Wealth alone would not have been strange. Ranchers had good years, cattle prices moved, land changed hands, a mortgage got paid down without anyone asking why. What made Three Rivers different was the timing, arriving on top of everything the country had watched Fall be for the better part of 2 decades. He had gone to the Senate carrying debt he never fully cleared. He had taken the Interior post, still owing money on land he had mortgaged twice over. Nothing in his salary, his ranch, or any business anyone could name accounted for a debt paid off, a boundary redrawn, and a herd restocked inside the same 12 months that his department had quietly signed away 2 of the Navy's sealed oil fields. A man does not have to announce a bribe. He only has to spend it somewhere his neighbors can see. New Mexico was not a large enough place to keep that quiet for long. Ranchers talked at fence lines and feed stores the way senators talked in cloakrooms, and what they were saying by the end of 1922 was simple enough. Fall had money now, and nobody could say where it came from. The talk did not stay contained to Three Rivers. It traveled east, the way rumors about oil money in the West always seemed to find their way into rooms in Washington sooner or later, carried by men who had reason to keep watching the Interior Department and did not like what a suddenly wealthy secretary implied about 2 suddenly leased reserves. What had been arranged in private letters and a black satchel and a stack of Liberty bonds now had a visible shadow, standing in fields 100 miles from the nearest federal building. A bond could be buried in a file cabinet. A satchel could be counted in a locked room with the shades drawn. A ranch stood in open country where anyone with a horse and a reason to ride the fence line could see exactly what had changed. By the time Fall understood that the ranch itself was the one witness he could not silence, the story of where his money had come from was no longer his to control. The discretion that had carried 2 secret leases past the Navy, past the Interior Department's own auditors, past every man in Washington who might have asked a hard question, could not survive a rancher counting cattle he knew Fall had no way to buy. No soldier and no rival oilman forced the question into the open in the end. A body that had spent years being told, politely, that the nation's reserves were none of its business did that, and before the year was finished, it decided otherwise. The ranch that had given Fall away would not be the last thing to fall under its questions. The Senate was coming. Chapter 9. The Senator Who Would Not Let Go. The ranch had given Albert Fall away to his neighbors. It took a senator most of Washington had written off as chasing nothing to make sure the rest of the country heard it too. Thomas Walsh led the Senate Public Lands Committee, and when it opened its investigation into the naval reserves in October of 1923, the leases at Teapot Dome and Elk Hills had already stood unexamined in public for close to 2 years. The committee had drawn little attention up to that point, the kind of body assigned to land questions nobody expected to matter. Walsh treated it as though it mattered. He requested the leasing files from the Interior Department. He called the men who had signed them to testify. He asked, without letting the subject move on, where a rancher who had spent a decade behind on his own taxes had found the money to clear them, restock his herd, and buy back his neighbor's land inside a single season, and he kept asking after the first answer arrived. The first answer was the loan story. Fall told the committee that the $100,000, now traceable to his ranch, had come from Edward Doheny as a private, interest-free loan between old friends, secured by nothing more than a note and entirely separate from any lease his department had ever signed. It was the same explanation the black satchel had been built to carry from the moment Ned Doheny set it down in an Interior Department office 2 years earlier. For a man accustomed to being taken at his word in New Mexico, the story might have closed the matter. In Walsh's committee room, it opened it further. Walsh wanted the note itself, its date, its terms, the bank that had supposedly handled it, and each document that surfaced answered one question while raising 2 more behind it. Fall sat through the questioning the way a man sits through weather he had already decided not to acknowledge. He answered what he had to answer, and volunteered nothing past it, repeating the loan story in the same flat terms each time it was asked of him, as though repetition alone could stand in for proof. It had worked in New Mexico, where his word had gone unchallenged for 20 years. It did not work in a committee room built for exactly this kind of question, where the record itself would eventually have to explain what he would not. The hearings ran on through the winter, and they did what 2 quiet years of leasing never had. They turned a transfer of federal land into a story the whole country was reading. Newspapers that had never printed the words Teapot Dome began carrying the committee's testimony on their front pages. A hearing room built for routine land business, filled instead with reporters copying down every exchange between a New Mexico rancher who had entered Harding's cabinet, nearly broke, and a senator who would not let a contradicted date pass without naming it. The loan story did not collapse all at once. It cracked one unaccounted transfer at a time, and every crack widened the audience watching it happen. Teapot Dome, a name that had meant nothing outside Wyoming a year earlier, was becoming the kind of phrase a stranger on a train could bring up without explaining it. If you are the kind of viewer who follows a paper trail as far as it goes, from a sealed oil field to a ranch fence in New Mexico, I would ask you to subscribe to the channel before this trail reaches the courtroom, because the chapters ahead are where it either holds together or comes apart for good. Before the committee was finished, its questions had already reached past Fall's ranch and toward the 2 men who had signed the checks. Doheny, called before Walsh's committee in turn, gave his own account of the same loan, calling the $100,000 a private matter between friends and no business of the government's. Sinclair offered the committee still less. But by then, the case no longer depended on what either oilman was willing to say. Walsh had bank records, transfer dates, and a pattern running unbroken from a black satchel in a cabinet secretary's office to a ranch in New Mexico that had gone from drowning in debt to clear of it in under a year. A Senate committee can subpoena a file and call a witness. It cannot convict a man or void a lease. What Thomas Walsh had built by the time his hearings closed was not a verdict, only the case for one, a record complete enough that the questions he would not stop asking no longer belonged to the Senate alone. They were about to leave his committee room and walk into a courtroom that could do far more than ask them. Chapter 10. The Court Takes the Oil Back. The courtroom Thomas Walsh had pointed toward did not keep the men waiting long. Within months of the Senate hearings closing, the government's own lawyers filed suit to void both leases outright, arguing that the paperwork signed inside the Interior Department was not a lawful transfer of the Navy's oil, but the product of fraud and collusion between a cabinet secretary and the 2 men who had paid him. The case climbed through the federal courts on the same evidence Walsh's committee had spent a winter assembling: the leasing files, the trail of the black satchel, the ranch ledgers that no longer matched a poor man's income. The newspapers that had spent that winter learning to spell Teapot Dome now had something firmer to print than testimony and denial. A Senate hearing can gather suspicion. A federal court could put a name to it, and the country that had followed Walsh's questions week by week now waited on a ruling instead of a rumor. It came in 1927. In Mammoth Oil Company versus United States, and in the companion case brought against Doheny's Pan American Petroleum, the Supreme Court of the United States ended the argument. Both leases, the reserve at Teapot Dome and the reserve at Elk Hills, had been secured through fraud and corruption, the justices ruled, and were therefore void from the moment they were signed. The oil beneath Wyoming's Teapot Rock and the oil beneath the hills of Kern County belonged once again to the government that had sealed them away for the Navy in the first place. It was already being called one of the first times the federal government had used its own courts to claw back public land signed away through corruption, and reporters covering the case treated the recovery itself as almost as remarkable as the fraud that had made it necessary. The reserve at Elk Hills alone ran to roughly 32,000 acres of California oil land, every foot of it now reverting on paper to the Navy that had set it aside years before Albert Fall ever held the office that let him sign it away. Sinclair's Mammoth Oil surrendered its claim on Teapot Dome. Doheny's Pan American Petroleum surrendered its claim on Elk Hills. Wells that had been drilling under a lease the Interior Department itself had signed were now, by order of the highest court in the country, drilling on ground that had never legally left the Navy's hands. What the ruling did not do was punish anyone. A civil case can strip a company of a lease. It cannot send a cabinet secretary to a cell or an oilman before a jury. The court had settled who owned the ground. It had said nothing about who would answer for how the ground had changed hands, and by the time the ruling came down, that separate reckoning was already gathering in a different courtroom, aimed not at Mammoth Oil or Pan American Petroleum, but at Albert Fall, Edward Doheny, and Harry Sinclair as men. The criminal cases ahead would take the same facts the Supreme Court had just called fraud, the same satchel, the same bonds, the same ranch ledgers, and run them through a jury box instead of a bench of justices. They were about to produce one of the strangest arithmetic problems American courts had ever handed down: two sides of a single bribe, tried apart, and headed toward verdicts that would not agree with each other. The arithmetic was about to begin. Chapter 11. The men who gave it walked free. The arithmetic began in a federal courtroom in Washington, where a jury was asked to decide whether Doheny had corrupted the Secretary of the Interior with $100,000 that Fall would, in a separate courtroom, be convicted of taking. It was the same satchel, the same 5 stacks of $20,000, the same trip carried by Doheny's own son. But it was 2 different questions put to 2 different juries, and the 2 questions were not the same, however identical the money. To convict Fall of accepting a bribe, a jury needed only find that he had taken money in exchange for a government favor and known what it was for. To convict Doheny of giving one, a jury needed to find something harder to prove from outside a man's head, that he had handed over the cash with the specific intent to corrupt a public official, rather than, as his lawyers insisted from the first day of testimony, extended an interest-free loan to an old friend from his prospecting years who happened later to sign a lease. Doheny's defense never denied the satchel. It could not. Too many people had seen it change hands. Instead, it built its case around the promissory note Fall had signed, the paper that made the $100,000 on its face a debt rather than a payment, and around 4 decades of friendship between the two men that predated the Interior Department, predated the Naval Reserves, predated Albert Fall's election to any office at all. A loan between old friends was not a crime. A jury in Washington in December of 1926 agreed. Doheny was acquitted. Sinclair fared no better for the government and no worse for himself. Tried on the bribery charge over the bonds and the cattle that had reached Fall's ranch, he too walked out of his own courtroom a free man. The charge of corrupting a cabinet secretary, unable to clear the same bar that had already failed to convict Doheny. 2 of the richest oilmen in the United States had handed a sitting member of the president's cabinet a combined sum approaching $400,000 in cash, bonds, and livestock, tied directly to 2 of the most valuable oil reserves the federal government owned, and neither man was found guilty of giving a cent of it as a bribe. Neither acquittal quieted the newspapers that had spent 3 years learning to spell Teapot Dome. A courtroom could rule on intent. It could not explain to a reader why the men who had carried the money out of the country's most valuable oil reserves were free to go home, while the man who had carried it into his own hands was not. The editorial pages kept asking the question the verdicts had left open, even after the juries had gone home and the courthouse doors had closed behind them. Fall's jury was not asked the same question the other 2 juries had faced. His jury was asked only whether he had taken the money and known what it bought him, and on that question, where Doheny's jury had found reasonable doubt and Sinclair's jury had found the same, Fall's jury found none. The same $100,000, moved between the same 2 men on the same afternoon, had produced a conviction on one side of the transaction and an acquittal on the other. 2 courtrooms had looked at one bag of money and reached opposite verdicts, and both were, by the letter of the law each jury had been handed, entirely correct. It is worth pausing on that arithmetic rather than rushing past it. Perhaps the law was working exactly as it was built to work, drawing a real and defensible line between the harder crime of receiving with corrupt intent and the easier one of merely paying. Or perhaps it was, in plainer terms, a demonstration of what the largest legal defense a fortune in American oil could buy was able to purchase in a federal courtroom that a rancher's salary never could. The film does not settle that for whoever is watching. It only lays the verdicts side by side, exactly as the juries left them, and leaves the question there, with an audience that already knows how the story of the black bag ends. On paper, the paradox settled which man the law would punish. It said nothing about whether the 2 verdicts described 2 different men or a single system that weighed wealth and want differently the moment either stepped into a witness box. The 2 oilmen came to their trials owning 2 of the largest fortunes in American oil. Fall came to his still owing money on the ranch that had first made him worth bribing at all. The paradox still left the ledger open. One man had been found guilty of taking the money, and his sentence was still ahead of him, about to make him something no American cabinet officer had ever been before. But one of the 2 men who had given it, acquitted of the bribe itself, was not finished with the federal courts, and what still waited for him there had nothing to do with the money he had paid. It waited for him because of what he had done to the jury meant to judge whether he had paid it at all. Chapter 12. The Jury. He shadowed. The answer arrived from a different courtroom entirely, and it did not concern money. Sinclair had already stood trial for the Teapot Dome lease and the bonds and cattle that had reached Fall's ranch by way of it, and on the question of bribery he walked free exactly as Doheny had, the same defense working twice over, a payment made, a corrupt intent unproven, a jury unwilling or unable to close that gap. Had the story ended there, Sinclair would have left Washington a free man, the richer and the freer of the two oilmen who had bought their way into the Navy's own oil. It did not end there. While the jury sworn to weigh his bribery charge sat in deliberation, Sinclair had arranged for private detectives to follow its members, watching who they spoke to and where they went in the days the case hung in the balance. A jury answers to the evidence and to nothing else. This one had been watched by the very man whose fate it was deciding, and when that fact reached the court, the crime it described had nothing to do with $100,000 in cash or $250,000 in bonds. It described the tampering with the machinery of justice itself, carried out by a man rich enough to hire the machinery to do it. Congress had its own account to settle with him. Sinclair had sat before the Senate Public Lands Committee, the same body that had spent since October of 1923 pulling the naval reserves apart in public hearing rooms and had refused to answer the questions put to him about the Teapot Dome lease. A refusal to testify before the Senate investigating the loss of the nation's own oil reserves was not a private matter between one oilman and his lawyers. It was contempt of the body meant to answer to the public on the public's behalf, and it carried a penalty of its own, separate from anything a jury box would later decide. 2 convictions followed, and neither was the bribery the entire investigation had been built to prove. Sinclair went to prison for contempt of Congress, for the silence he had chosen to keep in the hearing room. He went to prison a second time for what he had done to the jury meant to judge him, watched rather than left to deliberate in peace. Together the 2 sentences ran to about 9 months, and Sinclair served roughly 6.5 of them behind bars, not for handing a cabinet secretary $250,000 in bonds and livestock, but for what he had done in the 2 rooms built to hold him to account for it, the Senate chamber and the jury box alike. It sat strangely beside the arithmetic the previous courtroom had already produced. The man who had offered the larger bribe in the case walked free of the bribery charge and still went to prison, not because a jury found he had corrupted Albert Fall, but because he had tried to corrupt the process built to find out. The oil itself, the 32,000 acres at Elk Hills, and the reserve beneath the teapot-shaped rock outside Casper, had nothing further to say in either verdict. It had already changed hands twice, once by lease and once by court order, and the men who had fought over it were being sentenced for everything except the land. One of the 2 men who had paid had been answered for now, in his own strange fashion. The one who had taken had not. Fall's jury had already found what Doheny's and Sinclair's had refused to find, and the rancher, who had once been too poor to hold his own cattle through a hard winter, was about to become the first member of a president's cabinet ever sent to prison for a crime committed inside the office he held. Chapter 13. The First to Wear the Number. On the 25th of October, 1929, a jury in a federal courtroom in Washington returned the verdict: the rancher who had once counted every dollar he did not have could no longer escape. Fall was found, guilty of accepting a bribe, the same $100,000 Ned Doheny had carried to him in a black satchel 8 years earlier. The payment 2 juries under 2 different roofs had already refused to call a crime when the men who wrote the checks stood accused of giving it. This time the jury looked at the other half of the same transaction and reached the opposite answer. The money had not changed. Only the side of the ledger being judged had changed. The sentence matched the crime with a symmetry the money itself had never offered. The court fined Fall $100,000, the exact sum of the bribe, so that the penalty and the payment were, on the record, the same number changing direction one final time. It sentenced him to a year in federal prison, served in the end as 9.5 months behind the walls of a New Mexico penitentiary. No Secretary of the Interior, No member of any president's cabinet in the entire history of the Republic had ever worn a federal prisoner's number for a crime committed inside the office he held. Fall wore it first. The ranch went with him. 3 rivers, the debt-burdened spread that had once been too poor to carry its own cattle through a hard winter, the same acres whose sudden new fences and quietly settled back taxes had first drawn a senator's notice and started the whole reckoning, did not survive its owner's conviction. The land the bribe had rescued outlived the marriage of money and secrecy that had saved it. It did not outlive the man who had taken the money to save it. He left prison to a ranch that was no longer his to return to. 6 years had passed since Senator Walsh opened his committee's hearings into a rancher's unexplained wealth, 6 years in which the Senate built the record in public hearing rooms. The Supreme Court voided both leases and handed the land back to the government, and 2 separate juries cleared the 2 oilmen who had written the checks. Now, at the end of all of it, one man stood convicted of an offense the courts had proven only on his side of the ledger. It was not the ending the investigation had seemed built to deliver. The government had its land back. The bonds and cash Sinclair had paid, and the $100,000 in cash from Doheny's satchel that the land had bought, were never recovered in any courtroom, and never would be. Of the 3 men who had stood closest to the black bag on the night it first changed hands, only the one who had opened his palm to receive it lived to hear a verdict read against his own name. The other 2 did not. Ned Doheny, who had carried the satchel across the country as a young man running his father's errand, and Hugh Plunkett, who had carried it at his side and counted the stacks with him, were both already gone from the world before Fall's conviction was ever spoken aloud in that Washington courtroom. Neither man had lived to see the case they had made possible reach a verdict at all. Whatever the law still owed for the night, the bag changed hands. It would never reach the 2 men who had held it. He would serve his sentence in a cell with his name and a number on the door. The men who had carried the money to him would never serve theirs. What had happened to them had happened first, in a mansion built with the same fortune that had bought the ranch, and it had happened in a way the courts of Washington would never be asked to rule on. Chapter 14. The Black Bag's Last Victims. Greystone stood on a hill above Beverly Hills, the mansion Doheny had built as a wedding gift for his son, and it was there, not in any courtroom in Washington, that the case the black bag had started finally reached the end no jury would ever be asked to rule on. On the 16th of February, 1929, months before Fall ever stood trial, Ned and Plunkett were found dead together inside the house, in a wing not far from where Ned's own young children were sleeping. The official finding was murder and suicide, Plunkett first, then Ned. But the case was never entirely closed to public doubt, and for decades afterward, questions about exactly what happened inside that room persisted alongside the official record rather than being settled by it. These were the 2 men who had carried the satchel across the country 8 years before, who had counted 5 stacks of $20,000 each and handed them to a cabinet secretary as a loan that was never repaid and never meant to be. Of everyone the money touched, Fall included, they paid for it first, and they paid for it most completely. Fall would serve 9.5 months in a federal penitentiary in New Mexico and walk out of it again, an old man with a ruined name, but still, in the end, a living one. Ned and Plunkett did not walk out of that room at Greystone at all. The 2 juries had argued for years over whether $100,000 in a bag was a bribe or a loan. The 2 men who had actually carried the bag were not alive to hear either verdict read. Doheny had, by then, already been cleared in his own trial of giving the money his son delivered. He had won his case. He kept his fortune, his company, and his freedom. What he could not keep was the son the errand had been run for. He had raised Ned in the business, put him in the room when the deal was struck, and sent him, or allowed him to be sent, across the country with the cash that would outlive them both in the public memory. A novelist had already used Doheny's own rise from a prospector's shovel to a fortune worth more than most nations as the raw material for a book, and decades later that book would become a film remembered as one of the darkest stories ever told about an American oil fortune. By the time Greystone happened, Doheny no longer needed a novelist to supply the darkness. He had lived it. Out past the mansion and the courtrooms, the reserves themselves went on being what they had always been before anyone leased them, argued over them, or died over them. In the oil camps around Casper, beneath the rock the reservation had been named for, roughnecks kept working long shifts for wages that had nothing to do with the fortunes changing hands in Los Angeles and Washington. In Kern County, the crews at Elk Hills kept the wells running through a lawsuit that would eventually strip the lease from the company paying them. None of them had signed a lease, taken a bribe, or stood trial. They pumped oil out of ground the United States Navy still, on paper, owned, and they went home at the end of the day to towns the two dynasts fighting over the land above them would never have reason to visit. Every teaser the cold open had planted about the black bag now had its answer. The oil the Navy had sealed away had been signed off in secret. The $100,000 had been carried by the oilman's own son. The man who took it had gone to prison, and the men who paid it had not. And the two couriers of the bag were dead in the mansion the oil fortune had built for one of them, in a case the record never fully closed. Of the 4 dark facts that had opened this film, only one still had no ending. The land itself, the reason any of it had ever mattered, had not yet been accounted for. The men who had built the empires and paid for the land were, by the start of the new decade, disgraced, imprisoned, acquitted, or dead. The oil that had started all of it, the reason a cabinet secretary had ever been worth bribing in the first place, was still exactly where it had always been, still legally the property of a government that had spent most of a decade trying to prove it in court. What had not yet been decided, after all the trials and all the deaths, was what the United States would finally do with land its own Navy had sealed away for a war that had ended before anyone thought to ask. Chapter 15. What became of the Navy's oil? The one question no courtroom in Washington had ever been asked to answer was the plainest question of all. What would the United States finally do with oil its own Navy had sealed away, now that every man who had fought over it was dead, ruined, or wearing a federal prisoner's number? For most of the rest of the century, the government's answer was to do almost nothing. The reserves stayed exactly what they had been before Albert Fall ever signed a lease, property of the United States, held in federal custody. The scandal was over. The land had not moved an inch. That did not mean the story of the reserves had ended. It meant the next chapter was slower than a black satchel of cash, and it took most of a lifetime to arrive instead of a single autumn evening. In 1998, the federal government sold Elk Hills outright, the same California field Doheny's company had once leased in secret for $100,000 carried in a bag. This time the sale was public record, negotiated in the open, approved by Congress rather than signed behind a cabinet secretary's closed door. Occidental Petroleum paid $3,650 million for it, the largest sale of federal property in American history. What Doheny had once tried to take for the price of a loan, he never repaid. A different oil company simply bought, 76 years later, for a sum that made his $100,000 look like a tip left on a diner counter. Teapot Dome went the same direction, only slower. Wyoming's reserve stayed in federal hands for years longer, worked by contractors on the government's own account, until the Department of Energy sold it too, in 2015. By then, nearly a century had passed since the teapot-shaped rock north of Casper had given a hidden reserve, and then a national scandal, its name. The oil under both reserves ended up exactly where Doheny and Sinclair had wanted it from the beginning, in private hands. It simply took the country most of 100 years and an open sale instead of a hidden lease to get there honestly. Casper still stands in the shadow of the rock the reserve was named for, and the wells at Elk Hills, out past Bakersfield in Kern County, still draw oil from ground 2 oilmen once stood trial over. The men who actually worked those fields, the ones who pumped the oil and read the meters and never once sat in a courtroom over any of it, are not remembered by name the way Doheny, Sinclair, and Fall are. Their wages were never a scandal. Their labor is the reason there was ever oil worth stealing in the first place. If any of this happened near where you live now, if your family worked those fields once the scandal had passed and the wells kept running under new owners, or if a grandparent ever mentioned Teapot Dome as something more than a punchline, that inheritance is worth more than the joke the phrase became. You have now watched the fuller record, the reserves the Navy sealed, the bag that bought one lease and the bonds that bought the other, the ranch that gave the scheme away, and the paradox of a verdict that jailed one man for the same money that cleared another. This channel exists to find the real history behind the names that survive only as jokes and idioms, and there is more of it than a single video can hold. Subscribing costs nothing, and it is the surest way to be there for the next one. Doheny and Sinclair built fortunes large enough to have bought federal land outright, and still went looking for a cheaper way to take it. Fall sold the one thing he had left to sell, the trust of the office he held, for less than either oilman would have paid him honestly if asked. 2 young men carried a satchel across a continent and did not live to see what it finally cost them. The reserves outlasted every one of them. They outlasted the Senate hearings and the Supreme Court, the trials and the prison sentences and the deaths at Greystone, and they outlasted long enough to be sold again, in daylight, for a price no man alive in 1922 would have believed. The oil the Navy buried outlasted every man who ever tried to steal it.